Okay, fantastic. Tim, I thought your talk was really good, but I would say after a day and a half, it is a little bit depressing, and it makes you wonder what we should do. And I know there's a lot of wine here. We could do heavy drinking. Also, though, I have reflected a lot on Laudato Si, and happily it tells us what to do in there. The encyclical says, our goal is to become painfully aware, to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it. Okay, so that's what we're going to try and do in this talk. And then there's another part of Laudato Si. I was even depressed reading that for a while, but then it says, all it takes is one person to restore hope. But Steve and I think it might take two people, given the severity of the problem. So Steve and I have worked together for many years, and we're going to give an overview of an effort where we are fully aware of the magnitude of the problems, but we're just trying at this stage in life with many friends, many others, and many in this room, to turn knowledge into action. And I'll quote the Chancellor again here from something he wrote recently, saying, we decided to zero in on two of the most urgent crises: exploitation of people and exploitation of the planet. Both stem from a malevolent mindset that sees humans and the environment as expendable. We want this cheap commodification of people and the planet to stop. So that is actually a good backdrop to where we will start here, asking how do we stem biodiversity loss? And looking, oops, I have to turn my computer off now and focus over here. Looking at, let me see. Okay, thank you. The twin challenges before us of a huge fraction of humanity barely surviving, a lot of human suffering, and at the same time rapid decline, as we're hearing, of biodiversity and Earth's complex life support systems. So in getting into this, I want to say one thing first. We'll be focusing more on the science because we're in the realm of science here, it seems, but there are obviously such deep ethical dimensions here, and I hope we can get into discussion of the ethical dimensions, maybe now, but maybe a little bit later. I feel, as has been stated earlier, that unless we get into the ethics more and bring more of a philosophical or religious approach to this, we don't have any hope. We will be operating, like Paul said yesterday, just on the margins of the problem. So the hope, I think, is in waking people up, in looking at a place like this tea plantation in Uganda with that wonderful cloud forest in the background and shining a light on the values there, waking people up both at the level of awareness that it's not only tea and tea production that we're looking at, that we understand that ecosystem in the foreground so well, and we've developed institutions to manage it and market and sell the tea all around the world. We know next to nothing about that cloud forest in the background and the many values that it supplies humanity and that we might think about at a deeper ethical, empathetic level for biodiversity. But moving from there, we're now going to give a quick tour, Steve and I, of how we've come together with many others to try and address these problems. What science can we bring to bear on the problems? And the framework that we'll use a little bit through the talk just to orient us is focused on decisions at the top, changing the way people decide in our individual lives, in our corporations, in our governance, how, what choices to make, and relating those choices to impacts on ecosystems through looking at different scenarios, relating the impacts on ecosystems to change in delivery of services, benefits to people through biophysical modeling, relating that change in supply of services to human well-being through a lot of different approaches, but partly some modeling in a variety of areas, and relating that to institutions, and how we govern ourselves, how we take decisions, whether it's in informal or more formal contexts, through policies, incentives, and so on, the norms that Anne and others have been bringing up. So we founded an effort called the Natural Capital Project, and the whole idea is to work with people. So we emphasize the co-developing. Work with people to develop useful knowledge in addressing these problems, work with people in developing really practical tools, and we'll illustrate those, and then trying to implement those and scale up any success we find in the real world. So I'm going to tell a couple stories and then switch over to Steve. So the first story has to do with, just to get us on the same page, thinking about decisions and how they affect ecosystems and services. But in the beginning, I want to address a key problem in biodiversity conservation, and that is we've tended in much of the world, not so much in Europe, but in much of the world, to let go of the idea of actually harmonizing agriculture, livelihoods, and biodiversity. Yet much of the evidence shows that some of our best hope in the world is in achieving that harmony between people and nature at a biophysical level, and I imagine also at the level of waking people up and maintaining or cultivating empathy and more for biodiversity. So what can we sustain in the countryside? That's the first question. In areas where people dominate land. Here in a coffee-growing region of Costa Rica with a bit of forest, a bit of pasture in the picture. It's amazing. I've worked there with Paul Ehrlich and a lot of others for over 25 years now, and we've been quiet about our findings because initially we were not sure we were right. But it turns out there is a lot of native biodiversity that can live in these kinds of agricultural landscapes, more diversified agricultural systems like this royal flycatcher, which we just caught a few months ago. And if you look at the different groups, I'm sorry, this is small, you'll see, I'm just gonna show you, for plants, in this region of southern Costa Rica, where we've worked all these years, we find about 20% of the native plants you really only find in the agricultural areas in yellow. Those in green are restricted to remaining forest. There is about 30% remaining forest in this area, so quite a bit in little patches. Then you look at the other groups, you're wondering what will survive. Can an area that supports a lot of people with quite a lot of farming activity also support mammals and the flying kind, the bats? You can see many, over 60%, you encounter regularly in the farmland. Then you look at birds, about 70% of the birds are commonly in the farmland. And similar fraction for reptiles and amphibians. So even if this is a short-term thing, it's hard to say what will survive over the long, long term. But for many decades, this area was heavily deforested around 1950. So for these past decades, a lot of biodiversity has been sustained in these areas. In another study, and I know this is tiny, you don't need to read it, this shows the different birds living in the area, about 250 species that we commonly capture, and their relationships to one another. So the woodpeckers at the top are kind of closely related to the toucans, and those are related to the trogons and stuff. And you see in this close-up, for all of the birds, we've labeled each species as a little line coming out, and those in blue are restricted to the forest. But you see that those in green actually occur in the diversified farms. And all groups of birds, this is their phylogenetic relationship, all birds, all of that tree of life have some branches that live in the farmland. we were worried, well, maybe some huge groups, some huge limbs of the tree of life will be lost in farmland. But in this diversified agricultural system, we find actually every group is represented in the farmland, and some even in monocultures. The overall results of the 25 years I'm going to try and put in this one slide here is that, first of all, affinity for agriculture is distributed across the tree of life. Second, diversified agriculture, like you see in the picture, supports about 600 million more years of evolutionary history than intensive monocultures. So it's 300 million more years, fewer years than forest, than the native habitats. But a lot is sustained where people are, and it gives us hope of harmonizing people and nature across huge parts of the planet. And finally, it's just to argue that agricultural systems merit a lot more attention from different perspectives, but definitely conservation. So then you could ask, well, why protect rainforest? And just going very briefly, why would a farmer ever protect rainforest? We've looked at the role of rainforest habitat in providing biodiversity to pollinate, and you find a boost in both yield and quality of coffee in this one example. If you're near forest, you find a significant reduction in pest infestation if you're near forest. And then we wanted to study bats, but it became incredibly complicated. They do a mix of good and bad things for farmers, eating the good and bad insects. So to summarize, there have been thousands of studies over the past decade relating nature and human well-being. How do we move from these studies to policy change and to governance? I'm going to give one other quick tour relating another new realm of science that will set up the next talks. Urban mental health. With more and more people living in cities, there's a striking increase in mood and anxiety disorders among people living in cities. And this can be traced to the function of the brain. And in studies led by a student, Greg Bratman, at Stanford, involving people walking, taking that little bus from the psychology department and then taking a walk either on a kind of busy street, but nothing like in a mega city, or in a nice natural area. Just like a 45-minute walk where people do tests first, then they take the bus, walk, get back and do more tests, shows a striking difference from a short walk. So, for example, one of the tests involves little math problems and then remembering numbers in between solving these little math problems. So you look at that, true or false, 4 divided by 2 plus 1. Is that equal to 4? True or false? And then you get a letter. And then you sit there and you solve that, true or false, letter. True or false, letter. True or false, letter. And then you're asked, well, what was the sequence of letters? And it's incredible. I thought I'd remember only 3 letters, first of all, but the difference, if you look at the y-axis, in the number of letters remembered before and after a walk, you get 10, people who walk in the nature area remember 10 more letters than the people that go walk in the urban area. And there's no difference between these groups of people before they have their little walk. So it's a stunning impact, and you see this in many other types of studies, asking people to say how they feel, like in that quote in the middle, if they're ruminating, or doing different types of brain scanning before and after experiencing nature. So altogether, it just shows there's an enormous body of evidence that's built up now relating nature experience and mental health. About maybe hundreds of studies in this area, but ripe for synthesis, and now moving into policy and governance. There's a lot of interest on the part of the medical system in the US in this. And I'm going to turn over in a minute here to Steve, who's going to talk about developing practical tools. Do you see what a practical guy is? Making the most of wherever he is.
Great, thanks. So I want to kind of go the next step. So Gretchen has talked about the decisions that we make, basically how we interact with nature and the effect on ecosystems and the services coming back to people. So I want to think about basically how do we build practical tools which take us through this loop. So things that we do that change ecosystems, the services that are provided, and then coming back to our own well-being. And in talking with people and in doing this kind of modeling for a while, there are lots of different dimensions here. I think Anne mentioned the different kinds of, provisioning and cultural and supporting and regulating services, but, these are the many ways in which nature can impact upon our own well-being and worth of living. So we've developed a set of models that are up on the freely available on the computer, on the web, called INVEST for Integrated Valuation of Ecosystem Services and Trade-offs. And you can see some of them. So the green are more terrestrial, the blue marine. So for Jane's sake, we have a robust set of marine models. And really, again, trying to link all the way from changes that we make, decisions that we make that affect ecosystems, so that it's not just we lost the slides. If we can go back.
I wonder if I just turned my microphone on.
Okay, well, if we can go back. The linking there we go, from changes that we make, so decisions that we make that affect ecosystems, through to the various changes in ecosystem service, to changes in values that people would have. So if there was a change in the farming systems that Gretchen was talking about in Costa Rica, how does that affect the various ecosystem functions? How would that then relate to, say, water purification and quality going downstream, or the pollination services, or the various other things? So, as I said, we've used a set of models called INVEST, made this freely available up on the web, and this has been downloaded and used now in more than 100 different countries. I'm going to actually talk about something that was very early on. So I'm going to in a moment we'll talk about some more recent examples, but I want to take you to a very early example that we did, and this was in the Willamette Basin. Jane's house is about midway down there on the left in Corvallis. You just see this is a map of the current land cover. But what we typically will do is we will build from land use and land management questions if we're doing a terrestrial application, and then ask the question, how could we vary that, or what decisions could people make, and how does that impact the various outcomes that people would care about? So this is a simple example where we looked at alternative ways of structuring land use within the basin in order to deliver outcomes in two dimensions. So the vertical axis, it's too small to read, but the vertical axis is how well did a set of terrestrial vertebrate species do on this landscape as a function of the pattern of habitat, which is a function of the choice of land use. And on the horizontal axis, this is the returns that we get from timber operations, from agriculture, and from housing development. And for the economists in the room, what we've done is traced out the outer line there is basically a production possibility frontier. What's feasible in terms of conserving the biodiversity, the terrestrial vertebrate biodiversity within the Willamette Basin, and what's possible in terms of kind of the marketed returns on the horizontal axis. And so you get this idea of sort of what can possibly be done in the system. And one thing I want to mention specifically, especially in light of discussion yesterday where we were talking about trade-offs and, are there win-wins? So there's a red dot in the middle with an associated landscape, which was the current landscape when we did this analysis. and it's well within inside the frontier. So the point is, if you're doing things which are well inside the frontier, there are in fact win-wins. You can do better for both biodiversity and for the economic returns of the of people in the Willamette Basin. Once you're on that frontier, however, then it's a trade-off, and then it comes back to society's values of what it is that's most important, and that would determine sort of where you would lie. Would you be up towards the more green or natural forested habitat predominantly, or would you be more in the commercially dominated forests and agriculture as you move right and down in that figure? Okay, so as Gretchen has mentioned, we've tried to co-develop knowledge and co-develop a practical set of tools, but we're really interested in getting to implementation in the real world. And so we'll go through a couple of decision contexts where we've taken these tools and worked with various groups in order to try to make change on the ground. We're doing this in a number of different contexts. So the first example that I gave is more in the order of development planning. So thinking about how would a country or a region think about changing through time in order to accomplish various objectives, both economic and ecological. Securing fresh water. So I'm going to talk about an example next about providing clean water through actions upstream to users downstream. We're also thinking about an urban, how do we provide ecosystem services to people who live in cities. Private sector standards, so working with corporations and the private sector in order to improve how they both produce and distribute goods. And finally, resilient coastlines and thinking about coastal protection and other services provided at the intersection between land and ocean. So just a very brief history in trying to go from the science into implementation. So the first part was mostly science, building up the scientific foundation, so natural science, but also social science. So thinking about what do we need to know about all of those links that Gretchen showed. And that was, we did that a lot in the 1990s. We started to get to some real world, but very specialized cases. So many people perhaps know about the Catskills watershed that provides drinking water for the city of New York. And this is actually the prototypical example of a water fund, which I'm going to talk about next. The point is, there were real examples that were compelling, but tended to be sort of one-off or special cases. So we moved then 10 years later to how can we think about not making this a one-off or special case, but how do we develop an approach that could be applied anywhere with existing data and make this more of an approach that can be, you don't have to start over again every time you come up with a new application. And that was really the genesis of the Natural Capital Project that Gretchen and I and many other people have been working on. And what we're trying to do, many people have said time is not on our side. So how can we get to quickly spreading good examples where nature and people thrive? How can we spread that, have it go viral, do this more quickly? Okay, so I'm going to talk, Gretchen and I will, the last bit of this talk will be about thinking about scaling this up. So thinking about taking a successful example, demonstrating this in a compelling way, and then spreading it more quickly. So we're really, going all the way through, but really focusing on sort of this institutions and decisions part then. So we have been working, the dots on this diagram are examples of the various kinds of things. I'm going to focus now on securing fresh water and primarily focus on Latin America. So in Latin America, there's been a real movement towards what's called water funds. And water funds basically bring together downstream beneficiaries, so people who live in cities or industries downstream, with people who make decisions upstream that affect downstream water quality. So obviously the water flows from the left here downstream to the right. how can we make it so that there is a reciprocal trade, if you will? How can we bring it so that the people upstream realize the effect that they have downstream? Now, the way this actually works, so in many, like one of the really good examples of water funds was in Quito, Ecuador, and there you had a municipal water supply which got took part of the funds that they got for paying for water and used that money to work with people in the uplands, upper watershed, in order to put practices on the ground that would give clean water downstream. So it's really bringing together the people who are the suppliers of water with the people who benefit from having clean water downstream. So then the question is, well, what types of activities would you do in order to try to provide clean water downstream? And where in the watershed would you do this? So there are real science questions here, as well as kind of institutional questions, implementation. How do you make this so that it's both in the best interest of the farmers and ranchers upstream, as well as the downstream water users? So I'll just run through very quickly an example in the Cauca Valley in Colombia, where we worked with the Nature Conservancy. And in particular, I'm just going to show you one of the particular watersheds. So it's actually at the very top. And there's a city at the bottom end of that watershed in the orange dot at the bottom. And then upstream, various types of practices that we could implement. So everything ranging from protection of the land to reforestation, fencing, and so on. And so by running various scenarios of putting in these various practices up here and using Invest, how much, first of all, would it cost in order to do this? And what would be the increase in water quality measured in terms of % reduction in sediment? So one can think about kind of optimizing, or what's the best set of practices that you get the most bang for buck, the biggest increase in water quality for a given budget from the water company. So we've done this in the Cauca Valley. This water fund started in Quito in Latin America, and now there's great interest in spreading this to a number of other different locations. So now there are up to 40 different water funds. The Nature Conservancy is spreading this and interested in testing this in Africa and Asia. So it's a number of things that have to come together. Understanding the hydrology, the eco-hydrology, understanding the governance and finance, really being able to monitor, did your programs actually work and deliver the clean water that you had promised? But there's, it is a good model in the sense that there are kinds of things that you have to learn and have to be able to demonstrate, and this can, in principle, spread quickly. We've been using a particular model which is focused on sort of resource optimization within these watersheds, and given that this was from Latin America, we nicknamed it Rios, called it Rios. And I guess this is the sign that I need to take a break and give this back to Gretchen.
Okay, nobody else gets a break. So yeah, I'll give you one more example and then we'll wrap up, okay? This case is in China. We've worked in about 50 countries altogether. So amazingly, in 2012, the Communist Party of China, declared, oh yeah, you can't turn your mic off, declared China's dream as being creating the ecological civilization of the 21st century and harmonizing people and nature. And this might seem shocking, and here we read mostly about the devastation, the terrible flooding, the terrible air quality, and all the wonderful animals and plants at risk of extinction. So with this dream, there's a lot behind it that we could discuss, but it's an effort to develop the country and secure livelihoods while at the same time restoring nature. Now, how can you achieve that? These three questions come right to the fore, and the top leadership is asking, where to protect biodiversity and ecosystem services, how to secure natural capital, the biodiversity and services, and at the same time alleviate poverty. and how to move beyond GDP as a measure of performance. So going back a bit, in 1998, they had devastating flooding that affected tens of millions of people and was estimated to cost over $35 billion, and that's a big underestimate of the damages. Overnight, China implemented the largest sort of payment for ecosystem services scheme in the world. And you can see it here. All of the areas in green, those provinces, are receiving funding from the central government that comes from the provinces in blue. And it's basically a big wealth transfer system. The eastern seaboard is the recipient downstream of a lot of the benefits that are produced in western China. And they started paying 120 million households to change land use overnight because the flooding was caused in part by deforestation. So that was the first part of it. Then later, by about 2008, 2009, they officially adopted the INVEST models and have been heavily involved in testing and applying them. And they set up this new kind of protected area called an ecosystem function conservation area. And they set these 5 national priorities that you can see here for restoration. And amazingly, biodiversity is always held up as one of the 5 priorities. By a couple of years ago, they had greatly expanded this to encompass about 50% of land area in China is in a special zone where certain harmful activities with respect to biodiversity and services are restricted, and where people are compensated to restore nature through a system that Steve mentioned, where the beneficiaries on the right are paying in to the ecosystem service providers. And in that system, the idea is to change livelihoods in a way that benefits both people and nature. So there's a lot of attention to the 200 million people now being paid to restore biodiversity and ecosystem services in China, doing, for example, household surveys in the thousands to understand what people's choices are and why people, when they wake up through to when they go to bed at night, how they interact with nature, how they impact their surroundings, and what kind of payment system or development assistance program would actually lead to those dual goals of helping to secure livelihoods and at the same time restore nature. So at the same time, China has advanced very rapidly in developing this ecosystem assessment that created a system of accounts for natural capital. And I'll just show you a few maps. I could show you 100, but this showing where food production is, where carbon sequestration is happening, where sandstorm protection or prevention originates in the country, water supply. So they've started doing this very systematically and at a level far beyond any other country we're aware of. And they found that overall the investments have really paid off over the last 10 years for all services, but not for biodiversity. So as part of this assessment, a result of it, they're now setting up new nature reserves that focus much more on the south and east of China, where biodiversity is poorly represented in parks. So here, if you look at the park system, it's in green. If you can make your eyes focus on the green, that's where the park system is today. And yet, if you look at the blue, that's where nature reserves are now being proposed to conserve biodiversity, and in the orange, to conserve ecosystem services. And they're taking both approaches just to help motivate more conservation on land. It's a longer story, but a lot of economic pressures and competition for land, and both approaches are seen as key. And now Steve's going to gallop away with the last part of our story.
I'm learning something giving a joint talk and having your co-author put the slides in. But Okay. Okay, there we go. So one of the really interesting things so China has done some amazing things over the last decade or more, as Gretchen has said. One of the more ambitious things that they're attempting to do now is to create a different set of accounts. So instead of just basing rewards for provincial leaders and local leaders on the basis of how fast did their economy grow as conventionally measured, they want to also think about how has their governance of their province, how has that changed what they call gross ecosystem product, so the value of the goods and services from natural capital. And so we have been working closely with our Chinese colleagues to try to develop a set of reasonable measures for this GEP to counter, basically also be alongside of GDP. And so, it's a tremendously ambitious but also perhaps transformative way of thinking. So, people do respond to incentives, and if right now all of the incentives are through trying to rapidly grow as conventionally measured your economy, and now you're transforming that into thinking about measures of how well did you steward the natural capital of your system. As well as thinking about in a societal measure like a Human Development Index. So how has the three-legged stool, as opposed to focusing strictly on the bottom left? One of the questions that we're very interested in working through, and we're still, it's sort of early days on this, is thinking about how to report GEP. So many people, and some of the efforts I know that Partha has worked on and others, really interested to talk more about your experience in India, but trying to actually make this integrated into the system of national income and wealth accounts, as opposed to making this more of a standalone or a separate measure which really focuses on more either simply biophysical measures of how the natural capital stocks are changing, or changing this into a value metric. So there are a variety of ways that one can think about doing this. But the end goal of this, I think, is quite worthy and as I say, quite ambitious, but potentially transformative of the way that Chinese society rewards its leaders, and potentially going on down to thinking on the ground about how decisions actually get made. And I want to go back, actually, end with something not from China, but something very related, actually, from the United States. And this goes back over 100 years. So Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States, a nation behaves well if it treats its natural resources as assets, which it must turn over to the next generation increased and not impaired in value. This was over 100 years ago, and I think it's very well said. We might change one word to how it treats its ecosystems as assets, but basically, I think it was really well said by Theodore Roosevelt. Okay, well, we had one more slide. I don't know what's going on. There we go. Okay. So, in some ways what we're really trying to do here, not just for GDP as a particular measure, but in a larger sense, thinking about the various metrics that we have. So how do businesses track their performance? Right now it's just the monetary bottom line. Can we expand that? Can we go beyond in the system of governance and accounts beyond GDP? So, back in the 1930s, we didn't have GDP, and it was a tremendous advance to be able to have a systematic set of statistics which should tell you something about, how is the flow of income? Is it going up or down? Where are you in the business cycle? Well, similarly, we need to move beyond that and think about measures beyond simply the current traditional economic measures that we have. So this is a book on the right called Mismeasuring Our Lives by Stiglitz, Sen, and Fitoussi. And with that, I'd like to close and say, you know, this is really what we're trying to do, is to try to take these measures of how well are nature and people doing, and trying to systematize this so that we can do this more regularly, so that a provincial governor or a planner, land use planner, or somebody sitting in a corporation can have these tools available so that they know what impact they're having, not just kind of in a traditional economic sense, but more along their impacts on natural capital and ecosystem services. And with that, thank you very much.